Namaste everyone, welcome back to CodeCraft with Poonam. I'm coding mentor Poonam Agrawal. So this is session 7, our final video in this series. Okay, so in session 1 through 6, we built a complete understanding of Hibernate and JPA from scratch, right? Using plain Java, no Spring, no magic, no shortcuts, right? So what we learned in session 1 through session 6, that is ORM, JPA, Hibernate concepts and our first entity. And we have learned full crude with sessions, right? JPQL queries, like, and also filtering, searching, sorting. Okay. And we have learned entity relationships, right? And also we have learned what is lazy versus eager loading. Okay, and lazy initialization exception, right? And in our session 6, we have learned what is this caching, that is L1, L2 cache with EH cache, right? So today we come to full circle. Yes. So we go back to Spring Boot, but now with fresh eyes, every line of Spring Boot code will make complete sense because you know exactly what Spring is doing underneath. Okay. So for your better understanding, in session 1 to 6, you learned every job in the kitchen from the scratch, right? How to file recipe cards, that is your session and persist, okay, and how to find them, like we have used jpql queries, and how to organize sections, that is where we used entity relationships, right? And how to avoid unnecessary trips to the cabinet, that is lazy loading and caching. So you are now a fully trained kitchen expert. Yes. So Spring Boot is the smart restaurant manager who automates everything. So hiding the filing clerk, that is, we are creating session factory or entity manager factory. Okay. And coming to opening and closing shifts, that is transacting sessions per request, and handling shift handovers, that is for that we use transactions via @transactional. Okay, and keeping a shared memory board, that is where we used L2 cache via @cacheable, right? So you used to look at a JPA repository dot save method, right, and wonder what it did. So now you know it calls session.persist method or session.merge method. Okay, so you used to see at the transactional and shrug. Now you know it opens a session, begins a transaction, and commits on success. So let us pull back the curtain, all of it. Okay. So what you are going to learn today is the session factory creation, okay, entity manager understanding, JPA repository mapping at the transactional lifecycle, method mapping, JPQL generation, N+1 problem, caching, relationship annotations. Okay, so here how the Spring Boot's auto creates session factory as entity manager factory. And what entity manager is the JPA standard name for session. Okay, and how this JPA repository maps to exact Hibernate session methods. And what transactional does under the hood, that is session lifecycle. Okay, and how this all these methods like find all, find by id, etc. will map to our this session 2 code. Okay, and how Spring Data method names generate JPQL automatically. That is, we have seen in the session 3, right? And how this query with join fetch, which fixes this N+1 problem, which we have seen in our session 5. Okay, and how cacheable maps to, okay, which we have seen in this session 6. Okay, where you have learned L2 cache concepts, and how our relationship annotations work identically in Spring Boot. Okay. So now coming to Hibernate to JPA in Spring Boot. Okay. So where we have seen plain Hibernate, that is where we have created manually this session factory, right? And then after that Spring Boot configuration, where we defined our all the settings in our application.properties file. right? And then what we did here, Spring Boot build the session factory. Okay, so this was created automatically by the Spring Boot. And then JPA standard, where entity manager factory was automatically created. And now coming to Hibernate session to JPA entity manager. So here first what we did, we created a plain Hibernate, right? Using Hibernate session interface. And then Spring Boot integration happens. How? By injecting entity manager using @persistence context. Okay. And then we used JPS entity manager interface. This is JPS standard. Okay. And then what happened? Entity manager was managed by the Spring. So that is nothing but here Spring Boot JPA. Okay. So here entity manager is the JPS standard interface, right? So session is Hibernate's own interface. They do the same thing. Session actually extends this entity manager. So we have seen in our this session 6. Okay. So you never call entity manager dot close method in Spring Boot. Why? Because Spring closes it at the end of the request or at the transactional method. Okay. So now coming to at the transactional. Okay, this is the session lifecycle management. So this we used in our plain Hibernate project, that is in our session 2. Okay. So where we used this session is equal to session factory dot open section, which is used to open the session. And then the transaction begins by using this session dot begin transaction. Okay. And then we persisted our recipes, right? Session dot persist recipes. So here the actual work begins. And then we have committed our transaction, right? And then we have closed our session. This is our plain Hibernate project, right, which we have seen in our session 2. But coming to it Springboard, okay, we have used at the rate transactional. So if you missed my all the Springboard series, then you can once check it out. Okay, and also you can check my remaining Hibernate series also. So here in Spring Boot, we use this at the transactional. Okay. So here what happens is Spring opens this session and begins transaction automatically. Okay. So you no need to write all these lines. At the transactional will take care in our Spring Boot. Okay. So here you see how it is done. And then directly here you wrote your method, that is public recipe add recipe. Okay. And then map to entity, and then you're returning this recipe repository dot save here your recipe, right? So here Spring commits and closes sessions automatically when method exists. Okay, here you no need to manually this commit and close. Okay, and then if an exception is thrown, then Spring rolls back automatically. Okay, so you can see the difference, okay, with your plain Hibernate and in Spring Boot. So here this at the transactional is the Spring wrapper for everything we wrote manually. So it is not magic. It is just automation of exactly what we learned in our session 2. Okay. So now coming to JPA repository to Hibernate operation mapping. Okay. So here every JPA repository method maps directly to Hibernate operations. So here you see repository.save entity. Okay, this is the method which will map to this session.persist method. Okay, so here this is nothing but persisting a new entity instance, whereas this session.persist is nothing but Hibernate operation for saving new entities. Okay, and then here same repository.save here entity. This will map to session.merge. Okay. So here this repository.save method is used to update an existing entity instance, whereas this session.merge method is used to perform the Hibernate operation for merging existing entity changes. Okay. Next, this repository.find by ID. So this will map to session.find, that is recipe.class comma ID. All these things we have used in our previous sessions, right? So coming to this, so this is used to fetch a single entity by identifier, whereas this session.find, this Hibernate lookup for a specific class instance. Okay. And then coming to repository.findAll method. So this will retrieve all entries from the repository. Whereas, and this will map to JPQL select. Okay. So this will execute a JPQL query to fetch all. Okay. Next, coming to repository.delete method. So this is used to remove an entity from the database. So this will map to session.removeEntity. Okay. So this method here, Hibernate operation, is used to delete an entity. Okay. And then this repository.count method will map to JPQL count. So here this repository.count method is used to count total number of entities, whereas this JPQL count, it will execute a JPQL count query. Okay. And then repository.exist by ID, this will map to JPQL count which is greater than 0. Okay. So here this method is used to verify if an entity exists by ID. Okay. Whereas this JPQL count here, this checks existence via count query logic. Okay. So here Spring Data JPA generates all the implementation code for these methods. So you write the interface, that is Spring writes the Hibernate code at runtime. Okay. So now coming to Spring Data method names. Okay. That is here JPQL. So in our session 3, we already wrote this JPQL queries by hand, right? That is, let's see, session.createQuery. Okay, this is the statements which we have written manually. That is, select R from recipe R where R.category.name is equal to colon category recipe.class. Okay, so and we have set the parameters and then we have used to get result list method, right? But in Spring Boot, you will write a method name and Spring generates the JPQL. So let's see that. So here Spring generates this select statement. Okay. So we need to write this list of recipe, that is find by category name, and here you need to give the string name. Okay. And then Spring will generate select statement. Okay. This one for you. Just you need to give this one. List recipe find by cook time in minutes less than equal int max. Okay. And then Spring will generate select statement for this. Okay. Just you need to give this one. List of recipes find by name containing ignore case string keywords. Okay. So here the rules for method names, that is mapped directly to JPQL clauses, you already know, right? So now coming to @query and this join fetch. Okay. So this join fetch is used to fix the n+1 problem in our Spring Boot. Okay. So in session 5, we fixed this n+1 with join fetch in plain JPQL, right? So, and then here we used session.createQuery, the select statements manually we have given, right? And this get result list method, right? But in Spring Boot, the exact same JPQL goes in @query. Okay, so here in Spring Boot, what you are going to use @query annotation. Okay, that is you will be giving this @query, and here this is the select statement. Okay, and then this is list of recipes find all with category. Okay, this is a example. Okay, so here you can see the difference. Okay, if you write manually and if you use annotation. Okay, so you wrote this JPQL in session 5. Now you know what it does and why it exists. So the @query annotation is just a holder for the same JPQL you already know. Got it? So now coming to entity annotations, which is identical in both cases. Okay. So here every annotation we used in our sessions, that is 1 through session 6. Okay. It works identically in Spring Boot. So Spring Boot adds nothing. It uses the same JPA standard. Okay. Here you see. That is @entity. Okay. Which is same. Okay. And @table. This is also same. @id, @generated value, @column, @one to many, @many to one, @join column, and @cache. Okay. So, this is why learning Hibernate standalone first was the right choice. You did not learn Spring Boot annotations. You learned JPA annotations. So, they are the same thing everywhere. So now coming to at the rate cacheable, here Spring's abstraction over L2 cache. Okay, so in our session 6, we have configured this EH cache as L2 cache and used, right? So we used at the rate cache annotation there. Here, this is, right? And then this is for this public class recipe. Above this class, we have used this at the rate cache, right? But in Spring Boot, this at the rate cacheable is the annotation, okay? So this is a higher level of abstraction. So when you use it with this method, that is public recipe find by ID, this method, this at the rate cacheable recipes, here it caches the result of this method, okay? And when you use this at the rate cache event with this about this method, that is delete by ID, here you will be giving the values and key. Okay, so this will remove from the cache on delete. Okay, so these are the few examples which I am providing for your understanding. Okay, so here the concept is identical. That is cache results, serve from memory, evict on change. So here Spring just provides a cleaner API on top. Got it? So now, here we are going to see the full life cycle of our Spring Boot. So here we are going to see complete picture. That is what Spring Boot does for you. So here we are going to see how the Spring Boot startup, how it handles the request and caching. Okay. So here we are going to see the full life cycle. So here is the first step is when the Spring Boot starts up. Here it reads the properties file. Okay. So here you see Spring Boot reads application.properties for configuration, and then it creates the data source where you have the connection pool initialized. Okay. And then it will create entity manager factory. Okay, where you have used this session factory, right? So this will be created here, and then it will scan entities, that is at the rate entity. Okay, so these classes are scanned and registered. After that, it will create the tables, that is tables are created in the database, that is DDL auto is equal to create drop. Okay, and then what it does is it will create the repositories, that is JPA repository implementations are generated, and then transactional methods are called, that is we used at the rate transactional, right? That is method is invoked here, and then it will open the entity manager. Here what will happen is Spring opens entity manager, that is your session, for the request. Okay, and then it begins the transaction. So here the transaction is started for the request, and then business logic runs. So here your business logic will get executed. After that, JPA repository. Okay, so there we have used the save method, right? So here JPA repository dot save will persist or merges your data, and then JPA repository dot find by ID. Okay, this will retrieve the data from sessions, and then you will be coming and then transaction will get committed. Okay, so here transaction is committed, changes are saved, and then closes entity manager. So here entity manager is here, this session will closed for your request. Okay, and then after that this L1 cache will get destroyed for that particular request, and then L2 cache will persist. Okay, there we use this at the rate cache or at the rate cacheable, right? So this will persist across all the requests. Okay, so here every step is something we coded manually in session 1 through session 6. Okay, so why this series matters? Why? Because most developers learn Spring Boot first and never understand why their app slows down with hundreds of records, that is your N+1 problem. Why they see lazy initialization exception in production. What at the transactional actually does. Why find all method sometimes returns duplicates with @1 too many? What to put in @query and why you are not the developer anymore. So you started from the filing cabinet, right? You built everything from scratch. You watched every SQL query filed and understood why. So now Spring Boot is not a black box. So by now it is a familiar project run by a very efficient manager using all the skills you already know. So in the next section, we build the final Spring Boot project and connect every feature back to what we learned in session 1 through session 6. Okay. So this is for today's session. If you liked my teaching, then do let me know through comment and hit the like button and share it with your circle so that it will be helpful to them. And do not forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so that you will not miss any of my videos. Till then, keep learning, keep growing. This is Poonam Agrawal from CodeCraft with Poonam signing off.